Hey everyone, Connie here, and welcome to my review for the game Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. So right off the bat, I do want to say there will be spoilers in this review. I won't go into like a huge amount of detail about them, but there will be notable spoilers to the plot of the game Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Um, but I'm otherwise going to try to keep this brief. But yeah, there are some things that I really want to mention specifically here. So just letting you know ahead of time. So Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is the second Hyrule Warriors game, which is a combination of Legend of Zelda and the Warriors game series, such as Samurai Warriors, Dynasty Warriors, Warriors of Orochi, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of different versions of the Warriors games over the years. There's even one for One Piece, Pirate Warriors. There's actually four of the Pirate Warriors currently. So, yeah. I have number three on my Switch. Um, but Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is not just another Hyrule Warriors. It's not just another Warriors game. It's an actual direct timeline canon Legend of Zelda game, as in it does fit on the timeline. Now, prior to release, the game was advertised as being a canon prequel to Breath of the Wild. But as you play through the game, it's revealed that that's not exactly true. It starts off that way, but then it actually branches into a new timeline, actually separating itself off from Breath of the Wild. Um, which I didn't know going in, obviously, because all the advertising was just advertising it as a prequel and everything. But I don't mind. In fact, I think it actually worked. So, going into this, we're going to talk about uh, basically two main things here: how the game plays, as well as the story. And let's start with how the game plays. So I've played many different Warriors games throughout the years, or Muso games if you want to call them by that. I've played Dynasty Warriors, I've played Samurai Warriors, I've played the original Hyrule Warriors. So though just not the entire game, I've played a bit of it, but not all of it or anything, and I never had it myself. And obviously, like I said, I have Pirate Warriors 3 for One Piece. Um, and I've liked them. I enjoy them. But most of the time I couldn't get into like the story of them because it didn't interest me as much. One Piece being an exception because it's One Piece and you know, same with Hyrule Warriors. It's Legend of Zelda, so it's something that I already know I like and something that I already know the story will kind of interest me in. Um, and so the gameplay is very basic for the most part. It's like you go around through this map, fight off hordes of enemies, capture bases, use your specific items and tools to progress further and stuff. And you get to use different characters that have different kinds of specialties, different kinds of attacks, different ways of moving around, stuff like that. So it's very basic, but the way they execute it, the way they handle it, is extremely like good. It just every character feels unique. Every character feels like well to the for the most part. I'll get more into like the specific characters. There's a couple characters that feel like they're just kind of better versions of other characters. I'll get into that when I get into the story. Um, but for the most part, every character is unique, and there's a lot of characters. There's a lot of playable characters. There's always going to be one that fits your play style best. I know for me, the champions Urbosa and Mifa, as well as Link, tended to be my personal best to play as. Um, there are other ones that I really enjoyed playing as, but those were the ones I was definitely the best with. And there's also Impa, who is just OP. Impa's like the strongest character, the best character, like without question. So technically, she is the best I can play with. But I even other people like say she's super OP in the game. You get to use the different runes that you recognize from Breath of the Wild, because since this is a sort of prequel, sort of branch of Breath of the Wild. It does use the same models, does use the same aesthetic and everything, the same kind of items and runes and characters, all of that. So you get to use the runes. You could use like Cryonis and the bombs and everything like that. And the way different characters use them is different. Like one character might throw bombs normally, another character controls a weird bomb robot that can shoot out smaller bombs. Stuff like that. Um, some characters can fly. Other characters ride around on a sand seal and stuff like that. All the characters just act really differently, which make them stand out. Every character has a special move. They each have their own little like special action as well, which allows you to just combine different ideas, different styles. You get to collect these weapons and you can upgrade the weapons for each character. Each character has like different tiers of weapons, and some are better than others. But Link is the only one who really has. Well, Link and Zelda are the only two who have different types of weapons. For example, Link has swords, one-handed swords. He has two-handed swords. He has pole arms as well. He has multiple different kinds of weapons you can use, and it allows you to try out different kinds of styles for even the main character to play with. I always tended to use the one-handed swords. They always work the best for me with him. Um, but other people I know prefer the two-handed stuff, the more power-based attacks and all. On top of that, there's like boss battles that are just really fun, really intuitive on how to figure out how to master, how to see around certain um how do you put it? Certain maneuvers and whatnot. Um there are certain puzzles and stuff you'll have to solve, but usually they're pretty simple. Um Outside of that, there's a lot of resource collecting. The resource collecting is usually in order to upgrade weapons or get extra combos, get extra heart containers or special meters or stuff like that. And it's really necessary, and you'll be playing certain levels multiple times to try and collect these resources. And sometimes you'll be collecting them just to accomplish missions that won't do too much else. It's just like, oh, you accomplished this mission. Sometimes you unlock new stuff, like new shops, which also you can buy resources from. You unlock new ways to upgrade your weapons and stuff, and it all feels natural. Nothing feels out of place. Nothing feels wrong. Everything feels like it has a point, and it makes it feel good to play. It makes it feel like you're actually accomplishing things. Um, so let's get into the real quick before we get into the story. One last thing. Um, when you're playing, at least from my perspective, playing with a Switch Lite and everything, I have experienced, like, in terms of like gameplay, there's no real issues with the gameplay. Nothing like works wrong. Nothing doesn't work in any way. Um, so I don't know how it plays with Joy Cons. I don't know how it plays with a Pro controller or whatever else. I just know how it plays with this. There is very slight, very minimal lag when there's a lot of like enemies on screen at once and stuff, but it's very minimal and it won't affect anything. It's just if you're a stickler for that kind of thing, it might annoy you a bit, but it's minimal, extremely minimal. Now let's get on to the story. So the story is where a lot of the big spoilery stuff comes in, obviously. The story it starts off during the Great Calamity, the events of 100 years in the past of Breath of the Wild's main story, where Calamity Ganon is attacking and everything. Um, when Zelda uses her powers, a small egg-looking guardian awakens and travels back in time to before the Great Calamity, to try and protect Zelda. Because of this, Zelda works alongside Impa, Link, the researchers Purah and Robbie, and of course the champions in order to stop the Great Calamity before it even starts, using the information brought to them by the Egg Guardian. Um, so you go throughout these missions having to defeat all the enemies that are starting to appear. You have to um, like escort Zelda and stuff to places and stuff. And at first it's pretty simple, but as you start unlocking more characters, things get a little more complex. There's different other story missions you can go on to help with things, but that gets more back into the mechanics of it all. So as the story goes along, like I said, you gather the different champions, and start to continue to fight against the forces of Calamity Ganon, which includes the Yiga. The Yiga are involved in this, and you do get to fight them on many different occasions. But there's also a mysterious sorcerer who's pulling the strings even above the Yiga. And he's kind of in control of everything, and for most of the game is the main antagonist. Um, Once you get after a certain point, though, you start introducing some other characters into it, like Hestu and the Great Fairies, and then eventually, time travel is brought into it again as the champions of the future come into the past to help their predecessors. Yeah, we even get to see the likes of Riju, adult Sidon, um, Unobo, and Teba come into play. And you get to play as all of them. And this is kind of where we get into the couple characters who are kind of just better versions of the others. Uh, Teba is just a better Rivali. Like in every way, like once you unlock Teba, there's no reason to use Rivali ever again. Like Teba is just a better Rivali in pretty much every way, which is kind of ironic considering Rivali's extreme ego. Um, and Unobo, I would even say, is a better version of Daruk, although their styles differentiate a little more. But he's definitely better than Daruk, and really again invalidates needing to use Daruk. Um, Sidon, however, does differentiate enough from Mifa to feel like his own character and to not invalidate using Mifa at all. And kind of the same goes for Riju. Riju is, as I previously mentioned, the one who goes around on the sand seal, and her style definitely differentiates heavily from Urbosa's. Probably the biggest differentiating style of combat of the various champions. But after this point, things start to get real. I mean, at this point, you've already used the divine beasts to fight, which are some of the more interesting points of the game, but not as fun as I was hoping they would be, admittedly. I was hoping the divine beast sections would be a little more fun to play, but they end up coming across as a little tedious at times. They're still fun, but compared to the actual main missions, they're not as fun. Um, but you keep going along, and eventually, like, even the Yiga ends up switching sides, and there's this evil version of the Egg Guardian that's working with the sorcerer, and by the end, you just literally have to fight Calamity Ganon. Um, though, like, my favorite part is when Zelda unlocks her magic finally, and it's just this really triumphant moment, and plus it gives her a second type of combat, because before that she used the runes in this really eclectic way, and it's really bad. One of the worst one of the worst combat styles of any of the usable characters, in my opinion. It just has no rhyme or reason to it, like at all. But then she unlocks the Bow of Light, and it's like, holy shit, is it an improvement? And making her actually one of the better characters in the game. Not one of the absolute best, but one of the better ones for sure. But yeah, the story really kicks into overdrive once the Great Calamity actually starts, and you have to like really go into these battles. It gets a lot harder too. The difficulty does boost up a bit. Um, and in the end, like you stop the Great Calamity, and there's no need for the events of Breath of the Wild to happen, which is why I noted it as a split in the timeline. It's kind of like how Ocarina of Time splits the timeline into three different routes. It's kind of like that. Breath of the Wild is one route, and the events of Age of Calamity are kind of another route. Um, but they take place like in the same, well, mostly in the same time period. Breath of the Wild mostly takes place 100 years later, but still, you know what I mean. Age of Calamity basically invalidates the events of Breath of the Wild, um, but also doesn't actually take away from the quality of it or the fact that it's still canon on the timeline or anything. It doesn't retcon it, basically. It just changes it. That's a way to put it. um, so how would I compare it? Well, I haven't played Breath of the Wild a lot. I've played only a little bit of it. So, in terms of gameplay, I would probably say they're just too different to really compare. Because they're just completely different types of games. You can do completely different things. Even the runes, like they act kind of different. I mean, in Age of Calamity, they do kind of the same things, but the way you use them is different and all. Um, and the rules behind them are slightly off as well. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, they're just two completely different styles of games, so comparing them gameplay wise isn't really it doesn't really work. But how does it do story wise? Um, in my opinion, Age of Calamity's story is actually better. And I know that might be an unpopular opinion, but I think Age of Calamity actually does more work to develop these characters in ways that the original Breath of the Wild, even with the Champion's Ballad, just did not do. Like, Breath of the Wild did well, don't get me wrong, and I still love it. And overall, Breath of the Wild is still my favorite Zelda game. Um, but the way the characters are, well, characterized and developed throughout Age of Calamity, it makes them feel like more complete. Like mostly with the characters, obviously we've already met in Breath of the Wild, but even with the characters who are newer or the characters who we haven't seen in this way before, like Impa and Purah and Robbie. Like we've seen their older versions, or I guess technically younger with Purah, but we haven't seen them like this, and so they feel like almost different characters. And by the way, Purah is the best. Like I will fight you on that. Purah is definitely the best. um, but yeah, it feels like it develops things more, and the story feels more fully cohesive throughout. With Breath of the Wild, it's more told through the memories you get through the flashbacks. There's obviously a story in the current day at that point as well, but it's more spread out because of Breath of the Wild being such an open world game. The gameplay and everything kind of takes a lot more precedence while the story is more spread about. And a lot of open world games I've seen do that. Skyrim does that. Fallout 4 does that. Where there's definitely story. It's just, it's more spread about because of the type of game it is. With Age of Calamity, it allows the story to be constant, and also because of the time period it's in, because it's in like the past, the 100 years ago. It's all about like constant moving action, this war that is actively happening. In Breath of the Wild, it's 100 years later. Most of the kingdom is in ruins. Like the population is severely down, so there's not a lot going on. And again, most of the story is told through either the memories or these really spread about cutscenes that you only get at like certain like story point milestones, like when you reach Kakariko for the first time, or when you reach the different, what would you call them, champion lands, the different regions, I guess, of the champions for the first time, like the Gerudos, the Zora's Domain, all of that. When you reach them for the first time and get to meet the current champions and their families and allies and whatnot, so you have these big cutscenes and all. And when you're basically dealing with the divine beasts, um, so that there definitely is story in Breath of the Wild in the current day. It's just most of it is either spread about or told in the flashbacks, which is fine and it works for the game. But overall, I feel like it's just more consistent. And again, it that allows it to develop and build on these characters more in Age of Calamity in a way that just felt really satisfying. Especially, there are certain moments, for example, in Age of Calamity that really like hit me hard. Like when adult Sidon comes into the past for the first time and he meets up with Mifa, like I cried hard at that. Um, because just the meaning behind it. Because originally in the original timeline with that with Breath of the Wild, she died when he was just a kid. He grew up most of his life not knowing her. And so getting to see him as an adult meet her and talk to her and fight alongside her, it was just so moving. And again, I mentioned before, seeing Zelda unlock her magic, it made me bawl. It was just such a triumphant, beautiful moment. And even the ending when the champions of the future have to go back to the future rather than stay in the past, when they all say their goodbyes to the the past champions. It's really sad, but all this, at the same time, happy. And yeah, it brought tears. And like the original, like Breath of the Wild gave me a lot of feels too, and definitely made me cry on many occasions. I mean, the cutscene alone where Zelda breaks down like gets me every time. But I think Age of Calamity just did it a little bit better. And it's close. It's still very close. So it's not like Age of Calamity is just like really far up there, like beating Breath of the Wild or anything in terms of story for and characters for me. It's very close, and that's again one of the reasons why I still say Breath of the Wild is my favorite overall. But Age of Calamity, yeah, my second favorite Legend of Zelda game, like beating out Skyward Sword, which I still love, but Skyward Sword has had that place since Breath of the Wild came out and was my favorite before Breath of the Wild. So it kind of sucks to see it go down again, but it's also awesome to see another Legend of Zelda game that just hypes me up that much. And if you're not as into the Warriors gameplay style, maybe you won't get into it as much. But again, I'm fine with it. I have no issue with it. I've played it before, and I enjoy it well enough. And especially with how they handle it in this one, it's so much better handled than in the first Hyrule Warriors. It feels so much better to play. Um, but tell me your thoughts, because I've been talking a long time on this now, almost 25 minutes. Tell me your thoughts on Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. And thank you so much for tuning in. So for now, I'm Connie and I'm signing off. See y'all next time.